Hi folks, Mr. Olson here. Let's do some econ. Today we are looking at the resource market. We're going to do the supply and demand for labor in the resource market and then also take a look at the minimum wage. We're in unit 5 of microeconomics. We're looking at the market for resources. In addition to the resource market, other resources may call this the factor market or the input market. This is all the same thing. It's the factors of production, aka inputs, aka resources being bought and sold by firms and individuals. If you look at the circular flow, we're up here up in the resource market today. And one of the big things I want you to think about is, on the one hand, we're looking at supply and demand, which is something that you already know and should feel pretty easy. On the other hand, who's doing the supplying and demanding is going to be different in this unit. In the product market, individual consumers did the demanding and firms did the supplying. Not so in the resource market. As individuals in free market economies, we own the factors of production. So we're going to supply the land, labor, and capital in the resource market. So individuals are doing the supplying and firms are doing the demanding, because firms demand resources so they can combine them to ultimately produce products to sell. So that's something I want to repeat a number of times today, because that can often cause confusions for students. What we're going to look at today is the perfectly competitive resource market. And these concepts that I'm going to explain today apply for all resources. So they would apply for acres of land. They would apply for a number of workers. They would apply for capital like machines being bought and sold. However, I'm going to talk about labor because that's usually the easiest to understand for students. And it is oftentimes the most interesting. However, these concepts that I'm talking about today with labor apply to all types of resources. So in terms of resource markets, there are two types of resource markets: perfect competition and monopsony. In the product market, there are 4 market structures. In the resource market, there are 2 market structures. What does a perfectly competitive labor market look like? It's going to have many, many small firms who are out there hiring workers. No one firm is going to be large enough to manipulate the market. So it's going to be many, many, many firms. No one has that much market share. Okay. There's also going to be many, many workers, and we're also going to assume that those workers have identical skills. So whether you're looking for carpenters or gardeners or computer programmers, we're going to assume in this model that all those workers have the identical skills and experience, and therefore the wage is going to be constant. So the wage is not going to be changing. It's going to be set by the market, and therefore workers are going to be wage takers. Okay, so a comparison you can make to the product market. In the product market, firms are price takers, right? Whatever the price set by that perfectly competitive market is going to be taken by firms. In this case, workers are going to be wage takers. Whatever the wage is that's set by the market is going to be the wage earned by those workers. Okay, firms are going to be able to hire as many workers as they want at whatever the wage is set by the industry. Okay, so given those characteristics of the market, let's look at the demand and let's look at the supply. Okay. The demand for labor is the different quantities of workers that businesses are willing and able to hire at different wages. And again, thing here that's a little bit different is the businesses or the firms are doing the demanding. And the law of demand is still going to hold. The law of demand for labor says there's an inverse relationship between the wage and the quantity of labor demanded. In other words, as the wage goes up, the quantity of labor demanded goes down. Why? Because if firms have to pay workers more, they're not going to want to hire as many workers. On the other hand, if the wage goes down, the quantity of labor demanded is going to increase. Why? Well, because if the wage is lower, firms are going to want to hire more workers. What about the supply side? What's the supply of labor? The supply of labor is at different quantities of individuals that are willing and able to sell their labor at different wages. The individuals are doing the supply side here. The individuals are selling their labor. The law of supply is still going to hold. There's a direct relationship between wage and quantity of labor supplied. In other words, if the wage goes up, the wage is just the price of labor, right? So if the wage goes up, the quantity of labor supplied increases because those individuals want to work more if they could earn a higher wage. On the other hand, if the wage goes down, the quantity of labor supplied decreases. Okay. And what we're going to do in this unit is we're going to analyze workers, and we're going to assume that they only have two things they can do with their time. They can work, or they can have leisure time where they're having fun or relaxing or doing whatever they want. So there's a trade-off involved there. Okay. And when individuals are deciding if they want to supply their labor in a particular labor market, the opportunity cost is their leisure time. Okay, so if the wage is low, then your leisure time opportunity cost is relatively low because you couldn't be earning that much money anyway if you were working. On the other hand, as the wage increases, the opportunity cost of your leisure time increases, right? And sitting there and relaxing has a higher and higher opportunity cost because you could be earning a higher wage. So what is this actually going to look like in the graph? The graph for this unit is going to be relatively easy. We're going to draw good old-fashioned supply and demand. Like I've been emphasizing a few times over and over again, the firms are the ones doing the demanding of the labor, okay? And we can derive a demand curve showing the inverse relationship and all the different quantities that firms are willing and able to pay in terms of at different wages. Okay, so we are going to draw our vertical and horizontal axes. We're going to put quantity on the horizontal. We're going to put price on the vertical. Because we're looking at labor, this graph shows wage because the wage is the price of labor. And as you can see from this curve here, as the wage fall, the quantity demanded increases. And as if we go back the other way and were to increase the wage, the quantity demanded is going to fall. Okay, if the wage is up here, really, really high, then firms are not going to want to hire that many workers. On the other hand, if the wage is down here and it's really, really low, then firms are going to say, wow, I can afford to hire a lot more workers when the wage is that low. Okay, so that's the demand curve for labor. What about where does this demand curve for labor come from? Just like in the product market, it's the sum of all the individuals. So if we were looking at the demand for labor for fast food cooks, you would look at all the different possible wages and then the quantity of labor demanded by all the firms within that market. And if you summed up all the quantities of labor demanded by all the firms in that market, you would get a market demand curve at those wages. So again, that's what we mean by market. We're just summing up all the quantity of labor demanded by all the firms in that market. Okay, what about the supply curve? Well, as we've already emphasized, individuals are going to be supplying their labor, and if there's higher wages available, workers are going to have incentives to give up leisure activities or give up working in other industries and come on over to this industry. The higher and higher the wage is. Therefore, we see an upward sloping supply of labor curve. You can label it S or SL. This one writes it all the way out, labor supply, and you can kind of see if the wage is really, really low, workers are not going to want to work in that industry. Very few workers are going to want to work in that industry. On the other hand, if the wage is very, very, very high, the quantity of labor supplied is going to be much higher. Why? Because workers want to come supply their labor in that industry. They're going to leave other industries. They're going to stop being stay-at-home dads and stay-at-home moms and come earn that wage. All right, so how does this come together? Well, if we put our supply of labor and our demand of labor together, they are going to set an equilibrium wage. So let's say, for example, this is the market showing the supply and demand for carpenters. Whatever that equilibrium price is in the market is going to set the wage for that particular industry. And in this model, we have the equilibrium wage being $30 an hour. Okay, so this is a really important graph for you to understand because this is why people make the wage that they do in this society, in our society, right? Why do carpenters make $30 an hour? Because that's the equilibrium wage in the resource market for the labor of carpenters, right? So if you ever wanted to know why professional athletes make what they do, why carpenters make what they do, why teachers make what they do, the basic theory behind it is good old-fashioned supply and demand. Okay, so let's think, let's see if you can apply this with this little practice problem on the next slide. Okay, I want you to pause the video in just a second, and I want you to use supply and demand analysis to explain why orthopedic surgeons in the US earn an average salary of about $500,000, while gardeners in the US earn an average salary of about $25,000. So I want you to think about what the concepts we've just derived, and I want you to draw the market for surgeons and the market for gardeners, and then give me an equilibrium wage, right? And see if you can show me why this difference occurs. So you may have interpreted demand in different ways for this. I'm going to show demand the same in both of these markets. And the point I'm going to emphasize is the difference in supply. There is a really, really low supply of orthopedic surgeons in the US, which is going to, and because we have a really small supply, the equilibrium wage rate for surgeons is going to be really, really high. On the other hand, the people who have the skills in order to be a gardener in the US is relatively higher. So there's a larger supply of people who would be willing and able to supply their labor to garden in the US, which is going to make their equilibrium wage rate lower. Okay, so this is why people get paid what they do. What does this tell you for your career? When you're thinking about a career from an economic point of view, you want to choose an industry where the supply is really, really low and or the demand is really, really high, right? And the lower the supply and the higher the demand and the higher the wage rate is going to be, right? And then economically speaking, industries that you want to avoid are industries where the demand is low and or the supply is really, really high. Right? So this explains wage differences. If you want to think about this from a social justice point of view, and you want teachers to get paid more or social workers to get paid more or priests to get paid more, the thing that you can think about here is the demand for labor, right? So how are you spending your money? How are you donating? What are we doing with tax dollars? That's going to explain the demand for labor in those industries that you really care about, right? And you can vote with your dollars, right? And spend more on those on those products that pay the wages of workers you think should get paid more. Okay, so anyway, that's where wages come from. Pretty cool. All right, now, just like any market, the supply and demand for labor can shift, right? So what I'm going to teach you right now are the shifters of the demand for labor and the supply for labor. Most of these are pretty intuitive for students, so I'm going to give you the list, but most students kind of just think through this on their own and they don't necessarily memorize all the shifters. Let me show you how intuitive this is. Let's look at the market for pizza. Pizza is a product, right? So if there's an increase in the demand for pizza, then the price of pizza is going to go up. So the question for you to think about then is, how would that affect the demand for cheese? Well, if the price of the product of pizza increases, then the demand for cheese, which is a resource that goes into making pizza, is also going to increase, right? Because Pizza My Heart and Domino's and Papa John's are going to demand more cheese because they want to sell more pizza because the price of pizza is higher, right? And the same would be true for all the resources that go into cheese and pizza, right? So in theory, all other things equal, the price of pizza goes up, then the demand for cows and milking machines and even veterinarians would increase. Okay, so all these resources that go behind the products that we consume as consumers are going to be interrelated, right? And if the price of a product goes up, then the demand for those resources is going to go up. Okay, and this is the concept of derived demand. Derived demand is the demand for resources is determined, aka derived from, the products they helped produce. And this is one of the major determinants of the demand for labor, the concept of derived demand. Okay. And so in terms of formal shifters, that's number one. The idea of derived demand is number one. If we see changes in the demand for a product that resource is used to produce, it's going to change the demand for that resource. Okay. If there's a price increase in the product, it's going to increase the demand for that resource. Second shifter, changes in the productivity of the resource. So if there are technological advances in resources that are going to make resources more profitable because they are more efficient, then that's going to change the demand for that resources, right? So if a resource becomes more productive, it's going to increase the demand for that resource. If a resource becomes less productive, it's going to decrease the demand for that resource. And then finally, if there are changes in the price of other resources, that can affect the demand for a particular resource. Okay, there are substitute resources and complementary resources. Okay, what would be an example of substitute resources? Assembly line workers and robots, right? So let's assume assembly line workers and robots could both work on a car assembly line. Okay, and those are going to be substitutes when firms are deciding what to hire. So what's going to happen to the demand for assembly line workers if the price of robots falls? Well, if the price of robots falls, robots are going to become relatively cheaper. So we're going to see a decrease in the demand for assembly line workers if robots become cheaper. Okay. On the other hand, there are complementary resources. So firms combine resources, right, to create products. So let's think about the construction industry. Nails and lumber would be an example of complementary resources. So if the demand for, we want to know what happens to the demand for nails if the price of lumber increases. Well, if the price of lumber increases, the demand for nails is going to decrease because nails and lumber are used together. So the combining of those resources just got more expensive. So the demand for nails is going to decrease in this example. So go and pause the video. Here's some good practice questions for you to do. This has 6 examples. See if you can answer the problems to see if you get the drive demand here. And it is what we're looking for is increase, decrease, or stays the same. So question 1, there's an increase in the demand for microprocessors leads to an increase in the demand for processor assemblers because those assemblers are a resource in the product of microprocessors, right? So demand for microprocessors goes up, we demand those workers more. Number 2, an increase in the price of plastic pricing causes the demand for copper pricing to increase because they are substitute resources. Number 3, an increase in the demand for smaller homes leads to a decrease in demand for lumber because smaller homes need less lumber than big homes. For shipping companies, a decrease in the price of trains leads to a decrease in the demand for trucks because those are substitute resources. Number 5, a decrease in the price of sugar leads to an increase in the demand for aluminum for soda producers because sugar and aluminum are complementary resources in the production of cans of soda. And then finally, number 6, a substantial increase in the education and training leads to an increase in demand for skilled labor, right? So if you have more education and training, you're more productive. So those workers are going to see an increase in the demand for their labor. All right, let's look at the shifters of supply. So there were 3 shifters of demand. Let's look at the shifters of supply. Number 1 is the number of qualified workers. This can change because of education, training, and abilities required, right? So if workers get more educated or more get certified in a particular industry, that could increase the supply of labor. On the other hand, if the government adds new regulations to participate in that industry, that could decrease the supply of labor. For example, if the government required more training to become a waiter, that could decrease the supply of waiters in the market. Okay, same thing goes for government regulation, right? If waiters were required to obtain a license, then that would decrease the supply of waiters. Sorry, so that's government regulation. The example I was giving is more just the skills. Number 1 is more about the skills required in general. And then number 2 is if the government regulates those more. So number 1 is just more about the abilities required. But the bottom line is if people get more abilities, the supply is going to increase. And if people are get less training or colleges closed for something, then you would see a decrease in the supply. And if the government changes the requirements, then that could increase or decrease supply as well. Sorry, those overlap a little bit. Number 3 is personal values regarding leisure time and societal roles. So best example I can think about for this one is after World War II or during World War II, what happened to the US supply of labor? Well, there was a major increase. Why? Because women entered the workforce, and that was a change in family structure and expectations of genders in the US, right? So that can change who enters and exits the workforce as well, based on societal roles. Okay? So those are the three shifters for supply. You have them in your notes now for reference, but again, most students don't necessarily memorize these shifters. They are relatively intuitive when you read the problems. Okay, last concept we're going to look at in this screencast is the idea of minimum wages. So minimum wage is the minimum amount employers are allowed to pay their workers. And this is a concept that you already know from earlier in the course. This is just basically a wage floor. So a minimum wage is a wage floor. And there's lots of interesting changes and debates going on right now in our country about minimum wages and to what extent we should increase them. We're not going to get into those debates right now. What I'm going to show you is the basic simplified economic analysis of minimum wages that you're expected to know in the context of this course. And this is leaving a lot of the complexities and nuance of the current national debate to the side for the time being. Okay, so let's analyze a minimum wage as a traditional wage floor. Let's look at the market for fast food cooks. And as you can see, in this market for fast food cooks, all workers would be paid $8 an hour, and we would have 10 workers or 10,000 workers employed in this particular market, whatever it is. Let's just say 10 for the sake of simplification here. Okay, so if we were to add a binding minimum wage, what would this look like? Well, the government would say, well, we want to help workers because $8 is too low, right? $8 is not enough to support your family on. So we want to add a legal minimum wage, which would be a wage floor, which is going to be above equilibrium. Remember, to be binding, a price floor must be above equilibrium. So we're going to set a minimum wage at $15 an hour. What is that going to do? Well, as you can see, the quantity demanded falls. Why? Because at $15 an hour, firms are less willing and able to hire as many workers as they were before because they're having to pay them a higher wage. Okay, so we see a decrease in the quantity of labor demanded, in this case down to 7. We see an increase in the quantity of labor supplied. So individuals are going to increase the quantity of labor supplied at $15 an hour. Why is that? Workers who are already working in this industry are going to have an incentive to work more. Maybe you're working part-time before, now you have incentive to work full-time. Maybe you're working in another industry and you want to come over to this industry because the wage is higher, or maybe you were a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad, but now your trade-offs have changed because the wage is higher, so you may enter that market. And so based on the way we've drawn this graph, you can see now at $15, the quantity of labor supplied becomes 12. So what's the result? The quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, so we have a surplus in this market. And when we have a surplus of workers, that is unemployment. Okay, so what you can see here is that the minimum wage has created unemployment that didn't exist in that market that was before in equilibrium. Okay, and in fact, we can see that 5 workers are unemployed as a result of this policy here. Okay, let's do one more practice problem to see if you are getting it. You should be able to see the wage and quantity before the ceiling, and then as a result, before the floor, and then as a result of the floor, based on this graph here. So what was equilibrium wage before the minimum wage? It was $10 an hour and 100 people were working. If we created a minimum wage at $20 an hour, then 30 people would lose their job because the quantity of labor demanded would fall to 70. So those 30 people would get laid off as a result of the increase in the minimum wage. More people would enter the market. So we would have 30 people who lose their jobs, and we'd actually have 50 that are unemployed because the quantity of labor supplied increased. Okay, so 30 are going to be fired, 50 are going to be unemployed as a result of adding a minimum wage to this market of $20 an hour. Okay. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons why many economists think this is not the way that it works. Most economists don't like ceilings and floors in general. Minimum wage is the exception. Economists are about split on minimum wages. About roughly half of them are supporting minimum wage and even increasing the minimum wage, and then about half of them don't support minimum wages and think that they have unintended consequences. For the purposes of our introductory econ class here, though, this is the analysis that you're expected to show on the AP exam, even though the reality is much more complex. And this is one of those rare issues that economists are very split on. Last idea we need to talk about here is what are reasons that markets don't work as well as we've established in the slideshow, right? In other words, what are some labor market imperfections that make these wages not work out as clean as we've shown them to be in this slideshow? Okay. First one is insufficient and misleading job information, right? So a lot of times economists are going to say these labor markets don't work well. They're not as competitive as we've shown in the slideshow because workers can't see enough information, right? And if there's misleading job information or workers or wage information is not available to workers, then they're not going to be able to negotiate or earn the wage that they should be. Okay, so asymmetric information, especially for workers, is going to create some labor market imperfections here. Geographic immobility is going to create labor market imperfections. So the models we've established in this slideshow would have self-interested rational actors move to new industries and new places based on the wages that they could earn, right? And that's really common here. That's why Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. Many of your families may have come from different parts of the country or the world to come earn a wage here in Silicon Valley. But not everyone's able to do that. Not everyone has the financial or other resources to be able to move. So the wage settling on new equilibriums is not going to be as smooth as we would make it seem based on this lesson. Okay, and then things like union are going to make wages markets function differently. So if there's unions in an industry, collective bargaining and threats to strike are going to lead to higher wages, and wages may be higher than actually what the market equilibrium would call for, because unions could collectively bargain for higher wages. And then finally, wage discrimination is a huge issue that these models are not showing. If you're discriminated against based on your race or your gender, you may not earn the same wage as other folks who are in your same industry, right? It's very illegal in the US, but it's obviously a huge problem when you look at the wages of African Americans in our society, and when you look at the gender pay gap. Clearly there is instances of wage discrimination, and those aren't accounted for on these models that we've seen in class today. So there you have it. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day.